Red and blue lights danced across the surface of my pool like disco lights on acid as 6 patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of my suburban home. A half-eaten hot dog floated upside down in the shallow end. A unicorn float spun aimlessly. My nephew was mid-cannonball freeze frame, while Karen from across the street screeched into a megaphone like she was commanding a hostage situation. A dripping security guard tried shielding the governor's daughter from the blinding lights as officers with confused expressions tried to figure out why they'd been called to what appeared to be a backyard birthday party. A startled officer shouted for everyone to step back. Karen, gripping a laminated HOA handbook like it was the Constitution, barked that the party was illegal, unsanctioned, and potentially a front for political brainwashing. Then, from the back of the house, the governor's wife walked out with a towel over her shoulder and calmly said, "I'd like to report a false emergency call." That was the moment the police realized they had just been 911 baited into the most high-profile HOA blunder in recent memory. 12 hours earlier, the scene couldn't have been more ordinary. I was just a guy setting up a birthday bash for my nephew, Jalen, who had turned 10 that week. It was going to be a fun, low-key pool party. Bounce house on one side, rented margarita machine for the adults on the other, a taco truck parked out back near the alley for snacks, and colorful pool floats bobbing gently in the water. Nothing wild, nothing disruptive. At least that was the plan. The twist? Jalen's best friend happened to be the governor's youngest son, Luca. That meant this backyard party came with a few invisible strings attached. Like a background check on the taco guy. Or an unmarked SUV parked a block down with tinted windows. Or the polite but very alert man named Ray who introduced himself as an uncle but moved like he used to break ribs for a living. I didn't even realize the governor's wife was coming until Jalen casually mentioned, "Oh yeah, Mrs. T's bringing cupcakes." Mrs. T, in this case, being the first lady of our state. I blinked a few times and then asked if she needed parking. Jalen shrugged and said, "Nah, she's chill." And she was. She showed up in yoga pants, no entourage, just a smile and a Tupperware full of red velvet minis. For someone who probably attended 10 galas a week, she seemed relieved to be among cannonballs and Nerf guns. Everything was smooth until about 2 p.m., when the bass from the Bluetooth speaker hit that sweet spot of 90s hip-hop nostalgia and Karen's head popped over the hedge like a prairie dog. I saw her eye twitch at the sight of floaties shaped like flamingos and pineapples. She scowled at the taco truck, muttered something to her husband Doug, who immediately pretended to be on a call, and marched straight back to her house. That's when it started. First came the texts in the community group chat. Subject line: unapproved pool gathering. Then came the photos, close-ups of wet grass, a paper plate on the sidewalk, and a blurry image of the taco truck that somehow made it look like it was smuggling fireworks. Karen had a reputation. She wasn't just an HOA board member. She was its self-declared enforcer. She once cited a neighbor for wind chimes that she claimed disrupted her meditation. She measured lawn heights with a ruler and once threatened to report a squirrel infestation because she didn't like the bird feeder next door. To her, this pool party was an act of war. But what she didn't know was that the people she was about to go to war with were shielded by diplomatic immunity. Not literally, but almost. Around 3 p.m., she appeared again, this time with a noise meter. She waved it like a Geiger counter as it beeped from the thumping music. She shouted over the fence that we were in violation of HOA Article 4.3.2 regarding amplified sound. I offered her a cupcake. She declined. Vehemently. Then she muttered, "I'll fix this." 5 minutes later, my Ring camera caught her standing on her front porch, making a phone call. I could only hear one side. "Yes, I need to report an illegal gathering," she said. "There are minors drinking, possibly illegal substances, and I think I heard chanting. Might be political. Could be a protest. Yes, I'm serious." I didn't laugh. I probably should have. But when you've lived next to someone who once called animal control on a Halloween animatronic, you learn to take nothing for granted. Meanwhile, inside the house, Mrs. T was helping some of the younger kids put together balloon animals. The governor's son was in the garage playing ping-pong with Jalen. Ray was blending into the shadows like a forgotten coat rack, eyes constantly scanning, calm but alert. I started to get the sense that something was about to tip. I had no idea how badly. At exactly 4 p.m., the first patrol car showed up. Then the second. Then the third. Then 2 more. They didn't blare sirens. They rolled in fast and silently, which somehow made it worse. You could feel the tension as kids froze mid-splash and parents exchanged nervous glances. One officer stepped out with his hand on his hip, scanning the yard. I greeted him, doing my best not to look guilty for hosting what was essentially a state-level mixer disguised as a birthday pool party. He asked if I was the homeowner. I said yes. He asked if I knew how many people were on the property. I gave him an honest estimate, about 30, including kids. Then I told him we had a few guests with protective detail. His eyes narrowed. He asked if I meant bodyguards. I said yes. I asked him if this was about a noise complaint. He said the report included possible underage drinking, illegal activity, and the presence of influential figures who may be in danger. I nearly choked on my lemonade. That's when Karen marched up behind the officers, holding her phone in one hand and the HOA bylaws in the other, proudly explaining that she had documented everything and that I was a repeat offender of community policy. She referred to the party as a flash mob, claimed someone had parked a food truck over her tulips, and that she had seen teenagers doing suspicious dances. I pointed out that the teenagers were literally playing Marco Polo and one of them was her own niece, visiting for the summer. She didn't flinch. I thought the officers would laugh, but they didn't. They were professionals. They took the report seriously, until Mrs. T stepped out of the house. She didn't say a word at first. Just walked up, nodded politely at the officers, then asked if there was a problem. Karen gasped. One of the officers tilted his head, suddenly realizing he'd seen her before, on TV, at campaign rallies, shaking hands at charity events. Another officer subtly touched his earpiece and walked away to make a call. Karen's face slowly shifted from triumph to confusion to horror. But it was just the beginning. Because at that exact moment, Ray stepped forward and showed his credentials. And suddenly, everyone realized that this wasn't just a backyard party. This was a political family's private visit. Karen had just 9/11'd the governor's wife. And the fallout was about to get nuclear. The backyard, once filled with cheerful chaos and pool splashes, had turned into a surreal scene of whispers, murmurs, and sideways glances. Officers stood in small clusters, speaking into radios while trying to avoid the stares of very unimpressed plainclothes security. One officer near the driveway stood frozen as he listened to a voice on the other end of his earpiece. Karen, however, was still clueless to the level of catastrophe she'd just unleashed. She was pacing along the edge of the lawn with her phone camera turned on, proudly narrating her so-called victory. "This is what happens when no one respects community rules," she announced like she was filming a neighborhood crime documentary. There were kids in the pool, no permits for that food truck, and amplified sound above regulated levels. "And look at that, someone even brought a trained bouncer," she added, pointing at Ray, who looked at her like one might look at a mosquito trying to fight a tiger. Ray didn't move. He didn't have to. His entire presence radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of protecting people more important than HOA drama queens. The governor's wife stood beside him now, calm and composed, still holding the towel she had brought out earlier. She politely asked the officers if they needed anything further. One of them, visibly sweating despite the mild breeze, apologized. "Ma'am, I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, shifting uncomfortably. Karen's mouth fell open like a faulty garage door. "Misunderstanding?" she barked. "I documented everything. There are ordinances, sound limits, safety violations, children with balloons without adult supervision." The officer raised a hand gently, trying to de-escalate, but Karen's voice only grew louder. She pulled out a binder she kept in her purse labeled Emergency HOA Incident Log and began flipping through its laminated pages like she was about to present evidence in a criminal trial. I tried to reason with them. I did my duty. This is not a personal attack, she insisted, while pointing directly at me. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from anticipation of her perceived justice. That's when the governor's son, still holding a damp towel and a water gun, walked up beside his mom and said, "Is she always like this? Because if so, we're never coming back here again." The comment, said so innocently, landed like a grenade. One of the nearby officers stifled a chuckle. Another one turned his head to pretend he was suddenly fascinated with a flower pot. Karen was oblivious. Her eyes were locked on the officers, who were now beginning to see the entire situation for what it was, an exaggerated call prompted by personal annoyance, not actual danger. Still, protocol required they continue verifying. So they asked for ID from a few of the guests. Ray provided credentials that required a special number to validate. One of the plainclothes officers casually flipped a badge that made two cops step back and nod respectfully. Karen noticed none of this. She was too busy narrating into her phone for her imaginary audience, explaining how she bravely called the authorities while everyone else ignored the danger. Her audience, it turned out, was actually watching, because her HOA group chat was lighting up with live updates and screenshots. Unfortunately for her, most of the messages were not supportive. Instead, they were horrified. One neighbor messaged, "Did Karen just call the cops on the governor's wife?" Another wrote, "My cousin works for the mayor. This is going to be bad." Karen, still filming, didn't check her phone. She was busy giving the officers an unsolicited lecture on HOA zoning expectations and the dangers of unmonitored pool activities. While this circus unfolded on the lawn, inside my house a very different atmosphere had taken hold. Parents were quietly gathering their things, some clearly uncomfortable now that law enforcement was lingering near the property line. A few whispered to me if they should leave. I told them everything was fine, that there was no violation and no one was in trouble. Still, some left early, spooked by the drama. I didn't blame them. The whole mood had shifted, and the energy that once buzzed with balloons and pool noodles had settled into an awkward silence. Except for the kids. They didn't care. The governor's son and my nephew were now launching water balloons at a target made of stacked Solo cups on the patio table, oblivious to the escalating tension across the street. Then, things took another wild turn. A black SUV pulled up, slower than the others. The passenger door opened, and a man in a button-up shirt and athletic shorts stepped out, adjusting sunglasses and scanning the scene. That's when two of the plainclothes agents snapped into formation like chess pieces. The man walked up the driveway with the relaxed swagger of someone who didn't need an introduction. The governor had arrived. Karen didn't recognize him immediately. She was mid-rant, explaining to an officer why outdoor noise should never exceed 65 decibels in residential zones when he walked right up beside her. "Ma'am, are you the one who made the emergency call?" he asked. Karen turned, glanced at him, and replied, "Yes. Finally someone from the county here to back me up. This event is completely inappropriate." He nodded once. Then he looked toward his wife, gave her a small smile, and turned back to Karen. "I'm Governor Langston, and I'd like you to stop speaking immediately." Karen's mouth dropped so far it could have rolled into the pool. She stared at him like he had just sprouted wings. The realization hit her in slow motion, like watching a wine glass tip over from across the room. She stuttered, tripped over a fake apology, then pivoted straight to denial. "I didn't know you were involved," she said quickly. "I was simply enforcing neighborhood rules. This party looked unauthorized. There were people I didn't recognize." The governor raised an eyebrow. "You mean my children, their friends, and a community of foster kids we support annually?" Karen blinked. She clearly hadn't processed that yet. "That's right," he continued. "This wasn't just a birthday party. This was a charity event. Low profile. No announcements. Because we didn't want media here. And now, because of your 911 call, I've had to leave a conference and explain to my press team why my wife was questioned by police at a child's pool party. The silence that followed could have frozen the sun. Even the inflatable flamingo seemed to stop bobbing in the water. Karen tried to find words, but none came. She turned slowly to the nearest officer as if hoping for backup, but he took a step back and started writing in his notebook. The governor's voice dropped, calm but sharp. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done? Karen swallowed hard. It was just a call, she whispered. It was never just a call, he said. You weaponized emergency services. You embarrassed the community. And you endangered my family. His last words hit like a sledgehammer. Karen looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. But instead of ending the conversation there, the governor turned to me. I'm sorry this happened, Nate. We'll be filing an official complaint with the HOA. Expect contact from my legal team. And thanks for opening your home. It was a great party, until someone tried to turn it into a power trip. With that, he turned to his wife and kids, gathered them calmly, and began leading them to their vehicle. Karen stood frozen, HOA binder now hanging limp in her hand. Her voice. The atmosphere after the governor left was like the awkward silence following a slap at a wedding. Nobody quite knew where to look, what to say, or how to process what had just happened. The officers who had shown up in full response mode were now quietly filing statements and muttering into their radios with looks of disbelief. One patrol car backed out discreetly. Another remained, but the officer inside looked more like he wanted to melt into the seat than be part of this embarrassment. Karen, once the self-appointed general of neighborhood decorum, stood there like a malfunctioning lawn ornament. Her laminated HOA logbook drooped in her arm, her voice reduced to occasional gasps, and her face shifting between denial and sheer horror. She wasn't used to being the one scolded in public, and she definitely wasn't used to being embarrassed in front of an audience that included both local authorities and state officials. Meanwhile, inside my house, people were either whispering or leaving. Some neighbors offered nods of sympathy, a few said quietly they'd send messages to the HOA supporting me, and one guy who'd never said more than 3 words to me before clapped me on the back and said, "Hell of a party." The taco truck guy, bless him, stayed parked and kept handing out free churros like it was his way of processing the chaos. Jalen and the governor's son, Luca, sat on the edge of the pool like nothing had happened, dipping their feet and laughing about who had the better water balloon aim. It struck me how kids just keep going no matter what's happening around them. The innocence of it made everything Karen had done seem even more ridiculous. Ray, the governor's quiet security guy, returned to his usual stillness by the fence. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The way the local officers kept glancing at him said everything. They knew he wasn't just another bodyguard. He was connected to something bigger. I overheard one of the officers talking into his shoulder mic, saying, "The situation's de-escalated, but we might have a bigger issue. Civil misuse of emergency services, potentially state-level interference." Copy that. Karen was toast, and she didn't even know how deep the fire ran yet. That realization finally started to sink in when a black car pulled up across the street. Not a police cruiser, not one of the SUVs, but a sleek, government-plated vehicle. Out stepped a man in a buttoned shirt, ID clipped to his belt, a badge swinging lightly as he walked with purpose. Karen turned toward him, hopeful at first, thinking reinforcements had arrived. When he asked if she was the one who initiated the 911 call, her voice cracked as she replied, "Yes, but I was only doing my civic duty." He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply said, "I'm with the Office of the Inspector General. We've had a formal complaint. We'll need to ask you some questions." Her mouth opened and shut like a fish flopping on dry concrete. "You mean about the noise complaint?" she asked. He stared at her flatly and said, "About potentially interfering with the movements and security of state-protected individuals." Her legs wobbled slightly as she asked if she could go get her paperwork. He nodded and followed her across the street. She looked back once over her shoulder, the pride gone, the entitlement curdling into dread. Back at the house, I stood on the back porch and just exhaled. It had been the most surreal afternoon of my life. What started as a pool party had turned into a political meltdown, a law enforcement blunder, and a live HOA implosion. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so absurd. But then, as I looked around and saw that most of the kids were still playing, still laughing, and still eating cake with their hands, I realized something. The damage Karen caused wasn't permanent. The good vibes could still win. The community could still rebound from her pettiness. That evening, after most people had cleared out, I sat down on a lounge chair next to the now quiet pool. The unicorn float drifted into the corner. The taco truck guy gave me a final churro before heading out, saying, "That was the weirdest party I've ever served." I thanked him and watched him drive away, leaving the smell of grilled onions and corn chips in the air. I thought it was over. I thought we'd had our dramatic peak. I was wrong. The next morning, my phone rang before I'd even gotten out of bed. The number was from the state capitol. I answered groggily. A woman introduced herself as the governor's executive assistant. She told me the governor wanted to personally thank me for how I handled the situation and that they'd be releasing a statement about what happened. She said it would be tasteful, no names, no direct attacks, but it would address the abuse of emergency services. She then asked if I'd mind if they included a line in the statement commending the homeowner for remaining calm under pressure. I laughed, still half asleep, and said, "Sure, I'll take all the free PR I can get." She chuckled politely and said I should also expect a call from the HOA board. That call came 2 hours later. It was a conference call, which already told me it was serious. 3 board members were on. They were clearly frazzled, apologetic, and walking on verbal eggshells. They said they'd been blindsided by Karen's actions, that they hadn't authorized any of her behavior, and that an emergency board meeting was being held to determine whether she had violated the HOA's ethical standards. I didn't hold back. I told them this wasn't just about one party. Karen had been a problem for years. Her behavior had become a source of fear, embarrassment, and dysfunction in the community. They agreed nervously. One of them, a guy named Leonard, admitted that Karen had taken liberties before, but no one had expected her to escalate to this level. I could hear the resignation in their voices. They knew they were going to have to remove her. Around noon, another SUV pulled up, and this time, 2 different officials stepped out, state investigators in suits, not cop. They approached Karen's house. I watched from my front window as she answered the door in a robe and tried to smile. They didn't smile back. They entered, and the door closed behind them. 30 minutes later, she was out front again, visibly rattled, waving her arms as if trying to explain something. One of the men held a clipboard, the other a phone. Her body language screamed panic. And then the news vans began arriving. By late afternoon, the story had hit local news channels. The headline didn't mention my name, but it might as well have. Unauthorized 911 call sparks investigation after state governor's family caught in HOA dispute. The footage showed clips from neighborhood surveillance cameras and blurry phone recordings of Karen ranting at officers. By evening, the story had gone regional. Karen's photo was everywhere. Her binder had become a meme. Someone on Reddit dubbed her HOA Karen, Queen of Overreach. I had never seen someone go viral for the wrong reasons that fast. That night, as I grilled burgers for Jalen and my sister on the patio, I got another call, from the governor himself. He thanked me directly, again, and said his wife had insisted I be invited to a fundraising gala for the foster care initiative. He said she wanted me to know the party meant something. It had made her feel normal, human, safe. And even with everything that had happened, they appreciated what I had tried to provide. I didn't know what to say. I just told him they were always welcome at our home, as long as they didn't bring press. After the call ended, I sat back and watched the sun dip below the trees. The pool shimmered. The yard was quiet. I had no idea what Karen's next move would be, but one thing was clear. She had picked the wrong day, the wrong party, and the wrong family to mess with. And the consequences were just beginning. The sun was barely up when the HOA email landed in every resident's inbox, marked urgent in bold red letters. It was a notification of an emergency board meeting scheduled for that evening, citing a serious breach of protocol and misuse of HOA authority. Though it didn't mention Karen's name, everyone knew exactly who it was about. You could feel it in the neighborhood air, a rare kind of unity, like a collective exhale from people who had endured years of petty notices, nitpicking, and unsolicited HOA drive-bys. That morning, walking my dog down the street felt completely different. Instead of quick nods or silent avoidance, neighbors actually stopped to talk. Some asked if I was okay. Others laughed and said they never thought anyone could finally take Karen down a peg. And one elderly man with a cane leaned over his fence and whispered, "I've been waiting 15 years for this day." Inside Karen's house, however, the mood was far from celebratory. Her blinds were drawn, her front garden unattended for the first time in memory, and her mailbox stuffed with HOA notices that she usually picked up like clockwork. But she wasn't just hiding out. She was panicking. The visit from state investigators had shaken her deeply. What she initially believed to be a simple HOA enforcement matter had turned into a growing investigation, one now involving abuse of emergency services, unauthorized access to sensitive information, and even potential data privacy violations. It turned out that Karen hadn't just called 911. She had pulled security footage from HOA-shared surveillance cameras around the neighborhood. Cameras only accessible to board members, and only for sanctioned investigations. She'd saved clips, taken screenshots, and compiled folders on dozens of neighbors. The folders weren't just filled with noise complaints or trash can violations. They included photos of guests, timestamps of people coming and going, and even screenshots of social media posts tied to residents' addresses. She'd built her own little surveillance archive. And when the investigators started digging, they found she had accessed camera feeds multiple times outside official permission. It wasn't just petty anymore, it was invasive, possibly illegal. Worse, one of the folders she had created contained flagged photos from my party. Not just the kids playing, but zoomed-in shots of the governor's wife, her children, and the plainclothes security. She had labeled one of the files, "Suspicious Tall Man with Earbud," and submitted it to a private email account. That email, when reviewed by investigators, led to a bizarre web of neighborhood complaints she'd filed over the past 6 months. The state's cybercrime unit was looped in by mid-afternoon. The entire HOA system's access logs were pulled, and it became evident Karen had used her master key privileges not just physically but digitally, to snoop, download, and document things that were never her business. The press conference that followed wasn't planned, but it became inevitable. The governor's office released a carefully worded statement about respecting privacy, the misuse of emergency channels, and the importance of safe community spaces. Again, no names were mentioned, but the implication was crystal clear. Local news covered it nonstop. Every outlet ran footage of the original police response. Some even aired an enhanced phone video of Karen screaming into her megaphone and calling the taco truck a suspicious vehicle of potential concern. Late-night comedians picked it up by that evening. One anchor joked, apparently, "HOA stands for harass our authorities." When the emergency HOA meeting finally began that night, the community center was packed to the walls. People who hadn't attended a single HOA event in years suddenly showed up in full force. There were lawn chairs outside, neighbors standing by windows, some even bringing popcorn like it was opening night at a blockbuster. I walked in with my sister and Jalen, mostly just to observe, but the moment I entered, all eyes turned toward us. People clapped. It was surreal. I hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't planned to become some local hero, but in that moment, I realized just how many people had been quietly fed up for years. Karen had ruled with a binder and a bullhorn, and they were ready for that era to end. The board sat at the front like a makeshift tribunal, looking equal parts nervous and embarrassed. Karen, seated off to the side, was dressed in her usual pastel power suit, but she looked like a deflated version of herself. Her hair was frizzed, her eyes puffy, and the stack of folders in front of her looked more like a defense wall than anything helpful. When the board chair started the meeting, the hush was so complete you could hear someone cracking open a soda in the back row. They opened with the formal complaints. Multiple residents had submitted them following the 911 incident. Then they laid out the evidence found in the digital logs. Unauthorized access, violation of digital privacy protocols, unauthorized use of surveillance cameras, and finally, they read the clause from the bylaws stating that any board member found to have misused their authority in a way that endangered others or exposed the community to liability could be suspended pending investigation. Karen stood to speak, and for once, there was no confidence in her voice. She tried to blame miscommunication. She claimed she thought the party was dangerous because she had received an anonymous tip. She insisted she had every right to call emergency services and that she was just trying to protect the neighborhood. But the crowd wasn't buying it. A woman in the second row shouted, "Protect us? You screamed at a 10-year-old with a water gun." Another resident added, "You nearly got the governor's wife detained by police because someone's playlist had bass." Karen tried to retake control. She raised her voice, said she'd done nothing criminal, and that she was being punished for caring too much. That was when one of the board members calmly read out the police report stating she had provided knowingly exaggerated information to emergency responders and misrepresented the situation as a potential threat. The vote wasn't close. It wasn't even close to close. 4-0 with one abstention, Karen herself. She was suspended indefinitely from the HOA board pending full investigation, and her access to HOA systems, surveillance feeds, and community-wide communications was immediately revoked. The final motion even recommended a restraining order from accessing certain public HOA spaces until the matter was resolved legally. As the vote concluded, the room erupted in applause. Karen sat back down, stunned, as her papers fell from her lap. But the consequences didn't end there. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from a legal firm representing the state, thanking me for my cooperation and providing documentation in case I wished to file a civil suit for damages caused by the emergency call and public disruption. They didn't push. They just gave me the option. My sister encouraged me to do it, not for money, but for the principle. I hadn't decided yet. But it felt good to know that for once, I had power too. The funniest part? A week later, the governor sent over a thank you package. Inside was a plaque that said, "In appreciation for defending common sense." Below that, engraved in small letters, it read, "Also the best churros we've ever had." There was a photo of Jalen and Luca cannonballing into the pool, framed, with a handwritten note from the First Lady thanking me for hosting one of the most memorable afternoons her family had shared in years. It was strange, realizing that something as silly and petty as a neighborhood pool party could turn into a catalyst for change. Karen's house went dark after that. The blinds stayed shut. The clipboard was never seen again. Her once proud garden withered, and for the first time, kids walked past her yard without fear. Neighbors started organizing real block events, movie nights, lemonade stands, and game days, without the looming fear of a cease and desist letter. A quiet sort of joy returned to the neighborhood. I didn't need revenge. That was the beauty of it. The truth handled everything. All I had to do was hold the line, and keep the churros warm. The neighborhood was no longer the tense, rule-strangled place it had been just weeks ago. The air felt lighter, conversations longer, and laughter more frequent. Without Karen's clipboard shadowing every barbecue, mailbox flag, or misplaced recycling bin, people seemed to rediscover how to live. It wasn't that everything was perfect, but it was peaceful. And in a community where neighbors had grown used to whispered complaints and tense glances over hedges, peace felt like luxury. It was in that atmosphere of cautious optimism that the real transformation began, not in courtrooms or HOA boardrooms, but around backyard grills, over folding chairs at block movie nights, and through the small yet powerful acts of people reclaiming their space. The governor's office kept things relatively quiet after the suspension. There were no dramatic legal takedowns broadcast on the evening news, no loud statements designed to humiliate Karen. But beneath the surface, wheels were turning. While Karen sulked behind her drawn curtains, investigators continued their work, gathering every bit of data she had accessed, tracking every email, every suspicious use of HOA authority, and comparing it with both state statutes and HOA bylaws. Rumors swirled about possible lawsuits and formal charges related to misuse of surveillance data. I stayed out of it. I had already done my part by keeping calm in the moment, by not escalating things, and by letting her own actions write the ending to her reign of control. Now it was the system's turn to respond, and it was doing so with the quiet force of inevitability. One afternoon, as I raked leaves along the side of the house, I noticed two workers in uniforms removing the outdated security camera on the community's Main Street post. They waved and said the HOA was switching over to a third-party service with better privacy controls and stricter access procedures. I smiled. That was new. Transparency, reform, accountability. Words that had been nothing more than fantasy under Karen's rule were now showing up in real-time changes. Apparently, during their review of Karen's actions, the HOA discovered not only her breaches but also how lax their own system had been. They hadn't even required password changes for administrative users in years. That was changing fast. New leadership was being installed, and I was approached, not to join the board, but to help form a community advisory group. They wanted someone level-headed, someone the neighborhood trusted. It felt strange, but I said yes. The first meeting was held in my backyard. We set up a long table under string lights, and neighbors brought folding chairs and snacks. It wasn't formal or scripted. Just honest conversation about what we wanted the neighborhood to be. One guy said he just wanted to hang holiday lights without getting a warning letter. A woman wanted a small community garden plot without paperwork thicker than her tomato plant. Another wanted to host kids' bike races without Karen citing unregulated speed activity. We laughed, we shared ideas, and by the end of the night, we had a whiteboard filled with plans. The community was healing itself, not through revenge or punishment, but through shared vision and restored trust. But Karen wasn't done just yet. One final act remained. And like everything else she'd done, it was so out of touch with reality it almost bordered on satire. One morning, as I was setting up folding tables for a bake sale benefiting local foster programs, an idea suggested by the governor's wife herself, I noticed Karen's garage door open for the first time in weeks. Out stepped Karen, dressed not in her usual HOA-approved pastels but in a wrinkled windbreaker and jeans. In her hand was a stack of papers. She crossed the street with her chin held high, a half-forced smile trembling at the corners of her mouth. I wasn't sure whether to brace for a scene or offer her a donut. She walked up to my table and said, in the most clipped tone imaginable, that she was delivering a personal apology letter to everyone on the block. I looked at her, half expecting it to be a veiled threat in envelope form, but she handed me one and stepped back. I opened it. It was brief, typed, and surprisingly free of jargon. It simply said that she regretted how things had unfolded, acknowledged overstepping her authority, and wished the community well. It wasn't warm. It wasn't personal. But it was something. And for someone like Karen, even that small admission felt monumental. But that wasn't the surprise. The surprise came a week later, when the HOA issued a notice stating that Karen had formally resigned from all community leadership roles and forfeited her voting privileges. It wasn't forced, they said. It was her own decision. A quiet end to a loud legacy. Her house went on the market 3 days later. Word had it she was moving to a retirement community 2 towns over. No HOA. Just rules set by staff and resident. Ironically, the kind of structure she always claimed to support now turned against her in a far more rigid and controlled environment. The pool party that started it all became something of a legend. People still talked about it, even turned it into a funny neighborhood reference. Kids now called cannonballs governors, and joked about summoning the First Lady with cupcakes. It wasn't mockery. It was just the way people heal, with humor, with storytelling, with the little traditions that rise from shared chaos. That fall, when we hosted the end-of-summer bash again, we doubled the guest list. The governor's family returned, this time without undercover security because no one felt the need. It was relaxed, joyful, and full of faces that used to hide behind hedges and avoid confrontation. Now they laughed together, splashed together, and toasted churros with lemonade. One neighbor brought a surprise gift, a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "No Karen Zone, respect, kindness, and cannonballs only." We nailed it beside the gate. Everyone cheered. Even the kids knew what it meant. The governor's wife gave a small speech. She said that true community isn't built by rules and fines but by generosity, trust, and a willingness to listen. Then she pointed to Jalen and Luca, who were climbing onto the diving board with water balloons in hand, and said, "They're doing it better than most adults. Maybe we should take note." As the sun set and the lights flickered on, I stood near the grill, flipping burgers, watching a neighborhood come alive in a way it hadn't in years. There were no clipboards, no rule threats, no passive-aggressive emails. Just people. Human, imperfect, loud, and joyful. Someone passed me a lemonade and said, "You really started something." I shook my head and said, "No, Karen did. I just didn't let her finish it." The funny thing about change is that it rarely comes in neat packages. It crashes in during pool parties, arrives in awkward apologies, and stumbles out of garage doors in windbreakers. But it comes. And when it does, all you can do is open the gate, light the grill, and let the cannonballs fly. Because at the end of the day, a neighborhood isn't about who controls the rules. It's about who you want to share your backyard with when the sun sets and the music plays and the churros are fresh. And in that small corner of our world, we finally figured it out. No Karen required.